Aboriginal reserves. To introduce my topic, I will provide some background information. The history of Aboriginal people in Canada is rich and diverse. This history stretches long into the past, before the arrival of the European newcomers, with diverse interaction among different people, flourishing trade, and competition for land and resources. However, one question that many ask is, how are the living conditions on the reserves? And as a common myth, people begin to believe, if it's free, it must be good, but false. There are many difficulties and struggles that the First Nations have to deal with. In fact, many First Nations who have been interviewed on reserves have even said that we live to survive. The reserves lead First Nations into living conditions similar to those of underdeveloped countries. Imagine having to wake up early morning to boil water for clean water in a country like Canada. The reason being that most of the water that they receive is contaminated. Many believe that the government and public service employees are being discriminatory, and to address that, Cindy Blackstock, a Canadian activist, even addressed the issue by stating, "Stop discriminating in service provision." But water contamination is not the only issue troubling the First Nations. Imagine living in an overcrowded home with roughly 11 to 15 people in one home, and at least 5 sharing a room. Last year, there were 23 people living in a 2-bedroom home. There was not enough space that they had to take turns sleeping. Estimated costs are roughly $1.8 billion to fix this issue, along with the overall state of the homes. The government is not willing to spend that much. Other issues revolving the reserves would be bug infestation, electricity not being available, mold, and inadequate and in need of repair homes. These conditions all have a negative impact on the lives of the First Nations, especially the First Nation health crisis, which has been a Canadian problem that the federal government chooses to ignore. Sadly, there is limited access to quality health care, and thousands of children are being looked after by provincial child welfare authorities due to the conditions of the reserves. Now, more children are being taken away from their families than the height of the residential school era. As a result, due to poor conditions on reserves, many First Nations live in poverty, and not being able to help themselves, they do not receive the education that they need in order to succeed. Officials have stated that the intergenerational trauma may be to blame, which is a transmission of historical oppression and its negative consequences across generations. Also, low incomes earned on reserves is a factor that has escalated the high suicide rate among First Nations, and many of them are the hopeless youth. The remainder of First Nations decide to depend on a solvent, such as alcohol, to escape reality and issues facing them, just like back in the 1900s. So again, what are the living conditions like for Aboriginals on reserves? To answer this, it is utmost important to say that they are in poor, unacceptable conditions, which must be changed in order to provide First Nations with equality and the fundamental human rights that they deserve.
Created using Powtoon.